order the Wednesday, September 11th, 2019 Board of Education special meeting. I'm going to ask Illy Ortiz to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We're also going to take a moment of silence to remember all the victims and all the people that were impacted by the 9/11 attacks 18 years ago today, and all the families that are still impacted by it. So please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. We have some prouds to read tonight, starting with congratulations to our National Merit Scholarship semifinalist, Pujita Sunder. We had a great opening to the 2019-2020 school year all around. It says it on the paper, so it happened, you know, it did. All right. There is the Ossining Matters Run Walk that takes place this Saturday, starting at 9 o'clock. Registration, you can pick up t-shirts the Friday night before in the rec center. And I'm looking at my colleague, Greg Galiff, who's been here for a long time with the Ossining Matters event, and my other colleagues. So it's Friday night, you can pick up your t-shirts. Please join us for that. It's a really important event that raises a lot of money for a lot of programs that we do in Ossining. Also, please join us for an informational session on being a mentor on September 16th at 5 p.m. right here in the Ossining High School Library. And congratulations to Mikkel Vernon for making the LOHUD Super 7 selection 4 years in a row. So. And I'd like to take a motion to go into a work session. I'd like to take a motion for 4.1 and 4.2.
So moved.
Okay.
All right, so here we go. So tonight we have a really important presentation that'll be led by 3 of our building principals, Dr. Deely, Ms. Bardwell, Ms. Matthews, along with Ms. Sipos, and Dr. Alm will facilitate a discussion around a very important topic. Obviously, we're continuously seeking ways to best support the needs of our children. Really important topic that is noted in some of the learning that took place over the summer around trauma-sensitive schools. And I just want to read some excerpts regarding trauma and students. Trauma and stress can alter a young person's brain functions and impacting learning, causing behavioral problems, and igniting a cycle of violence. Poverty, violence, and sexual abuse, food insecurity, home instability are just a few factors causing brain-altering stress for our nation's children. And nearly 50% of children in the United States have experienced at least one or more types of serious childhood trauma. This is obviously a striking statistic and really important, particularly as we begin to think about how we best meet the needs of our children and knowing how to best address it as a collective system. So tonight is really a night of learning, but also learning how we as a system are doing some of the work to adapt to the needs of our children. So I know the Board of Education had an opportunity to watch a TED Talk. We're actually going to start with one more TED Talk to kind of just build some further understanding. I'm just going to go up, and what I'm going to ask you to do is we're going to start with some learning and then engage in some discussions about, so what does that really mean for us after hearing it? And then we're going to ask our 3 principals to come up and share some slides.
and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a pathogen chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem. Our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem.
There's more to the video.
So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle, and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you know, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand, better than we ever have before, how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior, and that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, It is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you'll want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and, frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real, and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you.
So we're going to pause right there just for a second before our colleagues come up to present and just try to make some meaning. In essence, really just kind of connect to the text or the video in this case, and sometimes we call this protocol, so what, right? So what does it mean to us, and what kind of connections have you made to kind of listening to Dr. Harris in this case? So I'm going to ask you to just pause, and just turn and talk to someone next to you, and the board, it might be triads. If our community members, aka our administrators, want to join the table just for a few minutes, and then we'll come up and ask our colleagues to continue us with our presentation. So take a few minutes to talk.
So what's the, so are you gonna join us? What are the implications for us? No. Gotcha.
All right, so why don't we come back for a moment?
But I think in the community too is a
Right,
big part of it.
yeah.
I mean, it can't just come from the school. The community needs to be involved. Somebody said somebody you need 5 trusted adults in your life. So I think we need to reach out and see what network we have in the community to
Flores,
establish
thank you.
those 5
Mr. Flores, you
trusted
ready?
adults.
All right, so we're going to come back. Obviously, you've had some time to make some meaning, and we're going to have a broader conversation a little towards the end. So I'm just going to encourage our colleagues to come up and begin their presentation.
Yeah, you gotta come back. Yeah. Leave it there. Dr. D, it's okay. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. So I'm sure we had an interesting discussion over here about the TED Talk and how daunting it can be, but also how much hope there is. So I actually picked this quote from the book that we read on trauma-sensitive schools because I felt that it is the hope. The brain's ability to benefit from enriching environmental experiences offers new hope for the thousands of children whose early life experiences are marred by adversity and trauma. Schools can become healing environments, and it goes on to tell us how. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about the history of the trauma-sensitive movement and kind of how it came to be, and then just a little bit about dealing with student trauma and the neurology of attachment. So this is a little bit of science going on in this book as we learned about what's going to help support our kids. So in terms of the history of the trauma-sensitive movement, what schools were facing was an increased number of behavior referrals, discipline referrals, an increased number of students not meeting academic milestones, and started to look deeper into the why. Why is this happening? They were also noting that zero tolerance policies were a failure. They were not working. And so again, looking into the why, and as we became more sophisticated in our research, both on an educational level and also in terms of the medical side of it, we started to learn a lot. Those zero tolerance policies where we said, this is it, you know, 3 strikes and you're out kind of thing, really impacted our children of color and students with disabilities at disproportionate rates, and clearly affected our kids who are dealing with trauma. So the evidence was very clear. It connected early trauma with academic failure. Many students with trauma have difficulty acquiring new skills, such as reading. There's dysregulation of behavior. It can affect attendance, executive functioning skills, and poor peer relationships. Traumatized students have lower scores on standardized tests, higher special education referrals, higher dropout rates, and more delinquent behavior. So better understanding of children's disruptive behavior and how to change behavior was really the focus of some of the work that researchers have done. So what neuroscientists have now realized is that the brain is a social organ. It develops within the context of attachment relations to ensure its health or threaten its survival. It's actually the attachment piece that children, babies have with their caregiver is actually completely connected and vital for the development of the brain. It's not just a nice thing to have, it's necessary. Trauma affects learning and behavior. So multiple exposures to trauma, and we heard Dr. Harris talk about some of those. Abandonment, abuse, exposure to domestic violence or drug abuse. They all affect children's academic and social development. What happens for kids is that, who experience multiple levels of trauma, is that it leads to a mistrust of adults, a hypersensitivity to perceptions of dangers or threats. So taking things that would seemingly not be a big deal to a lot of kids, but with a child who's faced a lot of trauma, heightened sensitivity, heightened perception, that example that she used of the bear, the fight or flight, that kind of feeling throughout the school day. So scientists, as I mentioned before, have learned so much about the neurology of attachment. The attachment process is the emotional glue that's needed for all future relationships. The attachment process enables children to feel safe. It contributes to the child's language development and personal agency, which is another term for internal control. Trauma and neglect can break down this attachment process, and as a result, children can lack a sense of internal control and have feelings of helplessness and despair. So brain plasticity, which is a term that was used throughout this text, refers to the brain's ability to change as a result of the child's environment. And the most plasticity happens in ages 0 to 5. So we were talking about Ossining basics. This is completely aligned. So babies and young children are the most vulnerable to effects of attachment failures. However, on the positive side, this plasticity also enables our young children to benefit from enriching, developmentally appropriate learning environments. So that same plasticity that can cause so much trauma can also be harnessed if we recognize it and we do the right things to actually combat those issues and to create really wonderful relationships and attachments. So children who face trauma are able to recover given intense early interventions that repair the attachment relationships so that positive connections can be made. Teachers and schools have a huge impact if they recognize and respond to early trauma. So I think when we first started to read this text, we were all feeling, very, very discouraged and very sad, to put it mildly. But as we read further and we started to investigate more, there is hope and there are ways to combat this. We just really have to make sure that we are going back to this history of the trauma sensitive schools movement, is that we have to know what we're doing so that we can respond in the appropriate ways. So some of the things that happen is children can respond to attachment failures in really one of two ways. One way is avoiding contact with others, specifically adults. And that's one way that kids might react to it. And what teachers need to do, if that's the case, is to provide sustained, consistent contact, show an interest, develop positive relationships, and keep trying, keep going. Because kids may say and look and show that they're avoiding, but that continued support and that consistency is really what will overcome that. Another way that children can respond to attachment failures is actually known as indiscriminate proximity seeking, which basically means children bond too easily with anyone who shows even the slightest interest in them. This can be really dangerous. It puts kids at risk for maltreatment by peers or adult predators. So we have to be on the lookout for both of those seemingly opposite ways of reacting to attachment failures. So these children need strong collaborative relationships with adults who set and maintain appropriate boundaries. At school, children who avoid adults can refuse to participate in activities. They can refuse to do classwork. They can be easily frustrated or demonstrate negative behaviors. And these children need adults, and deserve adults, I'll add, who convey safety and reassurance rather than reinforce negative patterns. So one of the things about this zero tolerance policy is that very firm, authoritative kind of response to behavior, to misbehavior, actually reinforces that trauma, and it does not do anything to support learning positive behaviors. So that's something that's really, really important. And so what can teachers do? They can build relationships by being playful, accepting, curious, empathetic. They need to observe children's nonverbal communication. They need to work to engage them in reciprocal interactions. Positive nonverbal cues like eye contact, gestures, all help. And attachment relationships will help all children. So all of these great strategies that they're suggesting will help all children, but especially those with histories of abuse or trauma. And these children expect adults to dislike or reject them. That has been their experience for some of our kids, and they deserve all that we can give them. So the more we know and the more we recognize and identify, the better we can respond to our kids. So my colleague, Dr. Deely, is going to talk a little bit more about this, about its effect on children's learning, and what we as teachers and educators can do.
So I'm going to do a very brief summary of trauma's effect on a child's readiness to learn, because I think it was explained really nicely in the video. But foundationally, disruptions in initial attachment, as Mrs. Matthews described, interfere with the development of representational thought. So that's, as we look at sensory motor development, empathy development, language development, and then ultimately attention, memory, and executive function. the development of representational thought is really the foundation. So again, the ability to use images and words to think about and distinguish the internal and external world is really the foundation of all these other processes. Again, it's the foundational to development of empathy, language, memory, attention, and executive functioning. So again, visual representation, to use an example, if we think about sensory motor development or the way we experience the world, it begins with mental images of concepts and then ultimately develops to words and interactions, relationships, and the ability to have empathy. So through sensory motor development, children learn to distinguish from their self and their internal world or their sensations. Through their caregivers or those relationships, they learn cause and effect. For example, they learn if you cry, that's going to either end your hunger or your discomfort. You'll either get changed or you get fed. Ultimately, that cause and effect, when you see a bottle, you cry, then you see a bottle, then you see that that bottle is a concept that is going to soothe you, and then ultimately there's a language development associated with that you learn the word bottle. So again, there's a sensory, then you also understand the interactions between the adult and the child and the baby, the interactions, the facial expressions that the parent provides. But again, this foundational concept of visual representation, sensory motor, mental images, concepts, and words lays the foundation for all of empathy, language, and then essentially it really imprints the brain, the front cortex of the brain, and I have to go back to the Broca area particularly, where attention, memory, and executive function are really imprinted. So this routine, through this constant routine of expressing a reaction, having your internal world projected into the external world, having it associated with concepts and then relationship and then needs being met, all of these processes develop. And children of trauma, however, have difficulty developing the ability to distinguish between feelings and needs of their self and with those of their caretakers, who often experience their own trauma. So again, children can't have a difficulty developing their own needs because the caretaker also has difficulty distinguishing their own needs from the child's needs. So most importantly, and I think this visual really kind of encapsulates everything that we learned, is just, first of all, the learning brain. If you're trying to survive, your brain is wired to survive that bear, but it kind of is not helpful if you're trying to develop a learning brain. But most importantly, what does the teacher do to facilitate a structured environment to help the child? Again, we talked in our group about neuroplasticity, that we can develop the brain, and there are strategies in the classroom that will help us do this by making sure that children understand and expect the routines in our classrooms. So how do we develop awareness of body language? Again, we're trying to get kids to understand empathy, that how I feel and how you feel. So through charades and through body language, exaggerated body language, we're trying to help kids understand the feelings of others. We can develop empathy, again, in addition to by using body language, by thinking about different ends of stories, or by considering, we can look at a story through the point of view of the main character, we can look at the point of view of supporting characters. So by looking at text through different points of view, it helps to facilitate empathy. We can use restorative practices to repair harm. Again, I think as Kate was suggesting, that kids are always trying to set up this scene where they know how they interact with adults, and they're trying to recreate this situation, maybe with adults in school or adults in the community, and that when we model how to repair harm when harm has been done, we teach more productive and empathetic ways to solve problems. If we integrate relationship building through our turn and talks, through cooperative learning, In the classroom, again, we're teaching children how to create relationships, how to, again, language being how do we communicate our internal thoughts with our external environment. So how do we do that through our instructional practices? How do we encourage interest in kids? How do we give kids hope? How do we help them look towards the future? So how do we get to know them, build relationships with them, understand their interests, and help them plan for the future to harness these strengths and interests? Again, it talked a lot about kids. These kids are sort of wired, right? All children who experience trauma for lack of consistency. So when we set up predictable environments, for example, using a consistent lesson plan format so kids can expect to receive lessons and information every day in the same way. And it actually talked only about not only a consistent lesson plan format, but one that integrates multisensory learning and language. And we used the SIOP model, which is the Sheltered Instructional Observational Protocol, which builds in linguistic opportunities for kids to talk about their learning, and it gives kids an opportunity to also represent their learning. So we actually have that in place. It also talked not only about consistent lesson plan format or a consistent way for kids to receive information and learning, but to have the same sort of routines, instructional routines in their classroom, and I can also expect, what can I expect behaviorally from this classroom? And that also accommodations that facilitate problem solving. So as we're trying to develop this child's brain, we don't want anything to get in the way. For example, if they need a calculator, basically to get to conceptual problem solving, and it's something that is going to help them with fluency, we want to just help them with the routine stuff to help them to get to bigger conceptual understanding as we're helping, again, to build and repair their brains. And we're going to go into a little bit more informing our learning through research with Mrs. Bardwell. Sure.
Good evening, everyone. So this is the book, I don't know if you've seen it, but this is the book that we read, Trauma Sensitive Schools, and where Dr. Harris was talking about how adverse childhood experiences could affect your medical and well-being. This book spoke about how adverse childhood experiences and chronic stress with children affects their ability to learn and affects their behavior in schools. Just kind of like bringing that back to what we're talking about. On this slide, there's two key ideas. And the first one is about nature's second chance. And Kate alluded to, Ms. Matthews alluded to the fact that when we were reading this book, you got about halfway through and it was like, oh my goodness, this is just so dour and sad, because it speaks to with so many children that we know in our district. And it was just like when you have something that is changing the way the brain works, it's like, well, so how do you recover this? And so the chapter that I'm talking about right here, Nature's Second Chance, is that recovery, that there is resilience in the brain, and that through proper methods and structuring, there can be a restructuring of those neural pathways to make a healthier brain. It does require, the brain is resilient, and it requires redesigning instruction, and it requires redesigning the behavioral supports that we in school have more traditionally fallen. And both Dr. Daly and Ms. Matthews have spoken about that. So picture the brain, because this book did speak to my total like geeky brain science mind, is that picture like you have that left side, the analytical side, and then you have that right emotional side of your brain. And if you have a brain that is constantly stressed and in that fight or flight mode of thinking, it doesn't connect that more analytical side. So some of the things that we do to assist children in connecting those pathways is to foster self-reflection. There's some very simple things here, simple in theory. So fostering self-reflection, you want the child to be able to learn to rein in their emotions, rein in their impulsivity, and to be able to think about, like, I'm feeling very upset right now and I can feel my body getting tense, but I have choice over this. I'm the one that can control this. So the kids, the students are learning to self-regulate and reduce their impulsivity. We're actually talking about retooling the brain pathways so that things work together better, so that subcortex down there, that real kind of primitive fight or flight, has a chance to connect with other parts of the brain. Often what happens is that students who have had these adverse childhood experiences or chronic stress in their life, they are unable to put words to their emotions because that's two different parts of the brain. So if you approach a child and say, "Why did you do that?" They will be unable to answer that. Not that they're being disrespectful, it's not a matter of them, they're just unable to put that emotion into words. So you're helping children to have a sense of what they are in control of and to have the language around their emotions. At Park School, we talk a lot about our feelings, and are you feeling mad or sad, or what those are in particular. So constant exposure to fear doesn't allow the brain to have accurate sensory input. And as a result, a child is oftentimes exhibiting hostility and disrespect. Another reaction is a child can be very withdrawn. So these two kind of arch feelings of how kids react to this constant fear are both very difficult to work with in the classroom, but so important. And it's important for our educators not to personalize those behaviors. And this requires a tremendous amount of will. We want to soothe that brainstem of a child and bring back equilibrium. We talked about the restorative approach, which something we've been learning about for a couple years and are now turning out into our classrooms in restorative circles, where we're losing that more punitive consequence approach to behaviors and understanding that it needs to be collaborative and problem solving. So again, moving away from that punishing model to a collaborative approach. Students who have experienced chronic trauma need to have safe, non-judgmental classrooms, and they need to have reliable figures in their life. They need the language to handle upsets, appropriate skills directly taught, social skills, and an adult who will assist them in making connections with other students, which might be difficult for them. The adults in their life need to offer and teach techniques in self-soothing and to be able to celebrate their accomplishments. The other part of this is recognizing that this is also extremely emotional work for teachers. This is really, really hard work. As teachers, we've all experienced children, as Dr. Dealey and Ms. Matthews was talking about, that these students will reenact these behaviors, which is, as an adult, it's like, why is this child treating me like that? Which you just have to depersonalize that, and this will happen over and over again, and that's a stressful educational setting for a teacher. You also have a lack. It can be seen as a lack of motivation, which is also something that you want to bring out of a child and adds a lot of stress to a classroom. There's this interesting component called compassion fatigue. And this was really interesting to me because teachers who on a daily basis and over years actually have a detachment, an emotional detachment, because this is just so hard to handle on a day-to-day basis. You have when you have kids who have these really big behaviors and these high needs, you need to emotionally detach so that you don't personalize that, and that in itself causes this fatigue. You also have educators who are listening to these stories from children, the very upsetting stories, and need to handle it in a professional way, and sometimes with very little that you can do about that family situation. What you can do is support and love that child and make a safe environment, but there's little that you can do for them outside of the school. So that is also tiring. So all of this adds up to needing our teachers needing emotional support. In a school, there needs to be a recognition that educators need the support. There has to be training around this paradigm shift that we're looking for. We're looking for a paradigm shift around that behavioral support, that behavioral management, to this more restorative approach. It needs to be understanding that the behaviors that we're seeing is not because a child is naughty or mean, but because this is intrinsic in their motivation to recreate these paradigms with adult attachment, and to, again, not personalize this. Teachers need to be supported in understanding that the fear that rules these children, that through consistency and soothing and reassurance, that those are the best methods to reach these children. It's all about relationships. It's something we talk to teachers about and create ourselves in our buildings. It's all about teachers and all of the educators in our buildings being able to connect to children and having them feel that safe and trustful relationship. For teachers, we also need to create for them supportive relationships. All the things we're talking about with kids, that resilience that we're trying to bring about with children, is also something that we want to bring about with our adults. So supportive relationships, gratitude, optimism. We need to spread that in our schools like wildflowers. Mindfulness, just like we're teaching our children. Mindfulness is something that we also want to practice with our educators, that we need to practice that. Self-noticing on the parts of adults when they get kind of triggered by behaviors or by children's feelings, and their ability to self-regulate themselves. So we can build partnerships that form resilience in our teachers so that they come back every day with a smile on their face. Thank you.
So there's certainly a lot to unpack there. We're going to ask everybody to get back in groups, 3 or 4 groups, and we're going to have our presenters, and the audience is certainly welcome to join us for this discussion. Here are a few prompts to help us further unpack all of that information. We have a very important video. We have 3 mini presentations that really answer the other question of kind of what is it that schools can do. So what are the implications for our work here in Ossining? And what do we know about our work here already? And what's our growing edge tonight? As a result of what we've learned with this really rich, robust presentation and a really, truly amazing summer read for our leaders, what is our growing edge? What is it that we really could do? And what should we be focusing on right now? So come on back to your groups and let's just talk that through.
Okay, you start.
Can I bother? Can you join that in the corner over there? Yeah, just grab your chair. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Kate.
Cynthia's up her left. Or, there you go.
So I did some research after her presentation because I thought it was so interesting.
I'm so sorry, I stole her from you.
It's a powerful group right here.
Greg's,
No, we're good with 3.
we can all slide down. Here,
We can just
do
make
this.
one big group, that's fine.
We figured we have like, it's a powerful 3.
This way.
One big one. One big one.
Oh, we've gone large. Okay.
Which is the counterpart
So what are you saying?
No, I was presenting my first question.
Oh, okay.
children who have adverse experiences but feel like they have someone to go to, they're supported, there's hope for them, they can make a plan
I think,
to change
you know,
their life.
doing here in Austin,
Right, the one adult that can make a difference, they have someone to go to, like, if they have
into
that in their
behavioral
life, it
issues.
doesn't necessarily matter, it could be an uncle, it could be a grandparent, it
mental
could be
health of
senior
our
parent, but
students
if
in
they have
general, and the fact that
someone
we're
who is helping them
digging down into
that
neuroplasticity
they are
and
able to
neurobiology, and these are things that they seem overwhelming. And to people, they think they have to be a professional to even pursue this, but it's really just human interactions and how you interact with people.
right?
I think one thing that stands out for me, as far as Ossining specifically, that makes it unique, that I want to always make sure we're doing this work through, is that we're a unique district that values equity and cultural competency and responsibility. Right? Because that bear that she's talking about, for some kids it's not, it's on the other side of the door, right? There's things happening in our society that bear, some people are dealing with two bears, right? And so being able to view this through a deeper lens, like I think that's what we're doing.
And there's actually a segment in the book that talks about
So I wonder for the child,
certainly, maybe I was
for the
writing
child
it.
that doesn't have a diagnosis necessarily of ADHD or ODD or, something that requires a by law planned action because they're diagnosed.
Right.
There are older, more aware students.
Need perhaps one-to-one
And even with
get them
technology, that
to support
it's like even no matter what age you are, exposed to certain things, your parents can't always protect you from information and things going on.
like how do we
So
ensure that they get what they
it's
need
just so
and
much
they're
more
able to
invasive now what our children are exposed to, and that fight or flight response is activated more often than we probably really recognize.
that sort of
Just seeing how that all fits together.
is kind of like part of this, and I don't know, I'm not so sure as though there's like
Question.
a bridge.
Disconnect. You guys seem very enthusiastic about this. Read the book, and which obviously has a lot more detail. My reaction to the video and conversation is, I feel like hopefully we're already doing a lot of this. And so I'm trying to match the excitement about this with the thought that hopefully it's not like this is that different, and that if we have a student who is constantly like not responding to suspension or discipline, that we're at some point saying like, hey, maybe there's something going on in the bigger picture that we need to address because this thing isn't happening. And I'm sure we're not in any way perfect. I'm just trying to figure out what's so different about this versus the
About
current.
that proactively, about like what are the kind of structures, what's the environment of the school, what's the environment of the classroom. That's not it's not the detective work after the fact, that we're setting up proactive environments. Right, ways about waiting for them to play out.
I think that's the excitement that you sense, right? Because we have, district committee, SEL committee, PBIS, certainly built into PBIS to have a better, broader understanding and get into the root cause of behaviors, for sure. But I think that maybe the big new thing that maybe students are excited about is this idea that we put all around the neuroplasticity, right? And I think also, as Dr. Lee was saying, instead of being reactive and having our clinicians respond in tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 of our interventions, right? Having an awareness of this in tier 1 allows us to get to the interventions in a mindful way much faster. And that's kind of the newness that you see.
Is that, I don't understand.
Sorry,
Plasticity and tears,
I
but
can do that.
so just a follow-up question. So the presenter mentioned 50% of kids in their studies have some trauma. Is what you're saying that we maybe have looked at it, like as in a classroom of 20, 2 or 3 kids have had trauma, and we'll deal with them on their own instead of saying, you know what, most, half these kids have something. We may not know what it is, but let's see if we can proactively do things to make it easier for everybody, sort of before we even find out what's there.
Perfect translation, verbose explanation.
It's not just here, right? It's like medical practice, right? Because professionally, because like ADHD, like he was telling us, like ADHD presents like trauma, and the treatments, the medications you give somebody if it's trauma and it's not ADHD makes it worse, right? At the end of the day, so like I feel like there's layers to the work we do here. There's like tonight, pull back another layer where you know, and it's like, oh, like what this is, but to see the physical, like the ability to examine the impacts on the body, the awareness around that in terms of what it does to like the amygdala or the other pieces, it's like really, that part's hopeful. I think that's what I think is the hopeful piece of like you're discovering more, and it's broader than just schools, right? It's a humanities thing at the end of the day.
I know screening was a big part of her thing. I didn't hear. Are we agreeing that we would somehow screen within the school?
We're discussing that in the SAL committee because there's some risk reward in that, right? So the risk is obviously that you're applying an ACEs score and a label to the student at a very early age. And there are actually folks that are advocating for that and not worrying about the label on our district-wide SEL committee. We haven't gotten to that point yet where we've said that, okay, you know, at an early age we're going to, you know, go through the protocol and assign a kid an ACEs score and understand them that way. That's happening with clinicians in the natural work that they do, rather than for every kid. But, you know, there are some folks in the field that advocate for exactly that.
It's come up in discussion. Some have asked, and probably sit on the, I'm assuming there might be even one person on the committee that really feels strongly that this should be taking place. We get our pre-K screening. But if you read some of these questions, it doesn't provide for a very warm welcome to Ossining. While it gives us information potentially on a child, but there's a second layer, you know, if there's signs of concern, then maybe that's the tool you pull out to get some further information, but it's not our universal screener for all kids. For me, I think in response to your question, it's just like a new phenomenon, and you know, everyone's excited about it. There's a buzz around it. For me, it's a confirmation of some of the work that we're doing. I mean, you know, what does it mean for Ossining? You know, one of the ways to reach kids is through building relationships with them, just at its foundational core. You know, we've been talking about that through whether it's advisories or other mechanisms to do that. There's circles, there's other opportunities that if you go through the book, you start saying, okay, gosh, we're doing some of these things. But, you know, there's the other aspect of, you know, are there other elements in our system where we can sort of elevate our responsiveness in light of what we're seeing? You know, we have students that, you know, that are coming from detention centers. I have 3 that I can tell you right now that have come from detention centers. Those students have experienced trauma. In my heart of hearts, they've experienced some level of trauma that we have to respond to and be understanding of potentially the story that's coming in. Not labeling them, but being responsive to them and finding ways to reach you know, the individual child. So, you know, we're not here to say in any way that like we have to like turn Ossining around. I think actually it's hopefully a confirmation of things like, to me, this is part of SEL, right? There's you know, kids finding interest and being connected to the school, and that's all, you know, part of this bigger story. And that's actually, you know, the other part is like what they said, you know, it's not a subgroup, right? This could be happening to all our kids. You know, it's all demographics, you know, and it's not one level of socioeconomic status, which sometimes is the place we go to. It's potentially all children. It could be my child. It could be any, you know, I mean, and it just tells us a little bit more as we, you know, put the pieces of the puzzle together. Of, you know, a child is sometimes a puzzle. We're just trying to figure out, and the more information we have and the more tools we have in our toolbox, the better, more responsive we can be to meet his or her needs and support the families in that process too.
Do we have a mechanism? Just thinking, you know, the detention center seems like an easier to identify one. The really bad divorce where the parent has a drinking drug problem seems harder to detect. Do we have any mechanism that, like, once we know it, like, kind of goes teacher to teacher, year to year, so that families know?
Yeah, it's almost like the mental, you know, first aid, you know, mental health first aid, and like, you know, that when Cynthia was talking about not being able to basically produce words, left brain, the right brain stuff, and you know, like, you know, what's going on, Brian, and you can't produce it, right? And you start to pick up those signs and, you know, those different things, and you want the adults to probably have a foundational knowledge to be able to identify some of that and at least skip resources, right? I guess the question is do we look at this broader to say we need to up the knowledge base of
this has been a huge effort. Like Alice Joslo has been very involved in trying to bring a deeper understanding to the community. She's led a few sessions, and because this isn't, in an ideal world, is when the whole community's considering and ways to address and support. So you're right. I mean, probably the best way to do is to elevate knowledge and understanding across the board to various stakeholders and see where we can fit as a community to do the work versus solely in the hands of the educators. So although that's an important part, but the more we can find ways within our community to be responsive, then it's always going to be better.
It just seems like it's a tough thing to get.
Sure is.
You spend so much of the day's hours of the day with teachers. At the end of the day, it's naturally the first line.
Yep.
Sorry.
One very small thing, when we give out food on Fridays in those purple bags, I was told kids are being made fun of because you can tell you're getting food because the bag is purple. I don't know if that has to do with anything, but one small thing we could do, change the color of the bag so kids can't identify who's getting it, and they can't make fun of kids for
Sure.
getting changing the service. The purple bag is just, people are telling me that that's a signifier and the kids are getting targeted because of that. So, just something I wanted to bring up. Right.
The movement that she was talking about in the TED Talk is basically finding a way to take the framework of all these different committees, all these different studies, and turning it into toolkits that can be dispensed to whether it's teachers or people in the community that are not just one size fits all, but can be applied equitably. There's a community-based rehabilitation.
Okay, we're going to come back together here in 10 seconds.
So that all the help is in one
Right. Yep.
right? So when you get there, you're not like so traumatized, harmed that there are all these steps along the way.
Yep.
Well, I can see by the lively discussion, we've done an excellent job unpacking this rich topic. Rather than reporting out each group and trying, attempting to summarize your conversation, can we instead just, spur of the moment with the spirit moves you, if we could just have one highlight from each group? Anybody in the group that feels like they can just say one thing that's a highlight or a takeaway that the whole room needs to hear? I'll start with my group because we have a lot of us, and somebody is probably eager to say one highlight.
So I'll start. And I mean, first the question became, what does this mean for our system? And in essence, what we started to really talk about is that we're doing a lot of work in response, and it's sort of a pause to say, the work we're doing is important already, and there are some tweaks that we're just modifying based on some of this new information we're garnering. And that, the education of children is complex, and this just tells us a little bit more of their story that we need to be cognizant of. But, the work around relationships, the work around creating, warm and welcoming environments, restorative practices, all of those are elements that are really, really important. And it just confirms, if anything else, that the work that we're doing is going in the right direction and is addressing childhood trauma, but also just good practices for all kids.
Well said. Dr. Sanchez, this group? Just one highlight.
Well, we talked a lot about sort of the holistic nature of not just educating a child and what's going on from a trauma perspective, but there are many different kinds of stressors that can impact how the body reacts, and that can be, Lisa brought up, it can be toxins from food, right? It can be, toxic stress at home. There can be a variety of resources for this. And then we discussed a lot about practically speaking, in need of extra nurturing is not a diagnosis in the DSM-4, right? And particularly when you have children that are getting older, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, grade and they are in need of an IEP that says in need of extra nurturing, give them one-on-one when the stress level becomes too high for them and they're disruptive in the classroom or whatever is going on, that there's no current system in place for that, right? And so I think that's where some of this push-pull comes into play with the discipline and removal from the classroom or the extra attention. And, I think it's difficult for the needs of that child to be met in the moment. And so I think we all kind of recognize that difficulty exists and that it's stressful for the students and it's stressful for the educators. And then, we did talk in the, small steps can make a big difference, and that's what we're focused on. And, putting the constructs in place, such as Calm Classroom, other things to really help it ever getting to that point. But I don't know, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have an IEP for in need of extra nurturing, and that was a diagnosis, but anyways, that's kind of what we talked about.
Thank you.
I know.
One last highlight from your group. Don't have to summarize, just a highlight.
We had mentioned a lot of things.
Right there.
Yeah, we mentioned similar themes as everyone else discussed. I think that one of the things that stands out is that we're doing things that are we've taken steps with mindfulness and restorative justice practices that may have begun to be implemented. I think this is going a little deeper, much deeper, and that the big step is how to get everyone on board. So what will professional development for teachers look like? How will we work in our district to have teachers own this so that it's being applied school-wide and especially in the classroom, so that we're being applied to ourselves. It's just not the kids who suffer trauma, but we as adults do. And is our trauma contributing to something that's going on in the classroom? It's just a lot of layers to this, but I think that the first step would be the PD that is going to be required.
Excellent.
Thanks, Felix.
Thanks for highlighting that. As we come back together, let's just give one more round of applause and gratitude to our distinguished presenters and leaders for giving us great information.
Thanks, guys. We can open it up for discussion if there's anything else.
So I just want to open it up to see if there's anybody else that wants to have any comments or discussion from the board, and then we can. Anybody? Comment?
So, one thing I think that was, pointed out, or it bears repeating, is that, Ossining is a very unique district in how deep we are into the needs of ours. We have multi-layered committees within the district that we're finding ways to weave together. The framework of that to build the toolkits to interact with the children on a more, holistic level. There's the aspects that I brought up as well that I think bears repeating is that, we are a very unique district in that we do have, we recognize the need for equity in everything that we do. Recognizing that there's different components to trauma. Some are internal, some are within the home, some are outside of the home. That perceived care that they were talking about as well, sometimes comes in different forms depending on your experiences in society, and recognizing that as well, and just finding ways to interweave our work into everything we do. Another very unique component of Ossining is that we do try to work in tandem with the community in everything we do, and I think that is also an integral role in rehabilitating or even proactively caring for the mental health needs of our students. The international
take the burden off of one person, or one staff member, or one, segment of the community, and that's how you lift it. That's the movement she was speaking about. Everyone has a role to play in this, and everyone can. You don't have to be a medical professional to address, needs for our children.
I just did thank everyone.
Testing.
Really well done. I thought you did a great job bringing this to us. The levels of awareness and understanding of this are just, daunting, but certainly hopeful when we walked away from it tonight. So I just think education is so complex, and this is a big piece of it, right? And just want to share that, the presentations really kind of provoked a lot of thinking, and I'm just grateful that we have leaders in our buildings and throughout the district that approach this in this way. So thank you.
I just want to point out, and I shared with our group, that for me what resonated was, we have an epidemic of autism in our society, and there's a lot of common examples that you gave about how a child is going through trauma, and so that came up for me, and I think it's really important in how we have, we do talk about behavioral plans, and I appreciated the comment from Trustee Catherine Crossling about the fact that it's about nurturing. And the other piece that we wanted to bring up is the sensitivity about, just because a child is behaving this way doesn't necessarily mean, there's something bad happening at home or that we're going to put the blame somewhere, just recognizing it. And I think everybody is commonly agreeing to that or agreed to that. So I think it's really a brave presentation. I think this is pretty complex and makes us rethink puts a lot of rethinking in it. And just as it was said about the professional development, that we're all, not doctors, or we haven't necessarily been around all of it and all these challenges, but really a brave presentation. So thank you so much, and really, really appreciate it. And appreciate all the groups and being able to discuss it. So, it's really helpful for everybody to speak about it. So thank you.
Yeah, no, so everything that needed to be said has been said, and that, just sincere thank you to our colleagues, thank you to everyone that's doing the work in our buildings and the board and the community members that are here to engage in the discussion. This isn't the only time we'll be discussing a topic like childhood trauma. It's been actually discussed in our community as well. I was just sharing before that Alice Child's has brought community members together around this. It's very important because it's broader than just a school, as Ms. Banta mentioned a little bit before. So thank you again for bringing this up. It's a really important topic, and I agree. I'm very thankful for the great leadership we have in our buildings and the district that help foster and support the good work that needs to take place on behalf of children. So thank you, everybody.
So our next topic is discussion of our 3-year plan. Discussion. We'll let everybody else. So we're leaving, and okay. So our next discussion will be presentation will be on the 3-year plan, discussion regarding our finances.
Yeah, so this is more of a dialogue than a presentation. In our 3-year plan, there is an element that calls for a 3-year financial plan. And Lita Zuber has done this in the past for our Board of Education. She's done where she's just projected the year and has also looked at long-term 1 year, 2 years. So one of the requests from the Board of Education was for us to create a 3-year financial plan. Obviously, knowing that I think it's really important, there's a lot of variables that are unknown from year to year. So when we think out 3 years, I would say it's probably safer to go a year, 2 years, if anything, or even a year. Nonetheless, Lita is starting to do some work, and before she completes it and submits it to the Board of Education, we thought this was an important space to just get some information on variables we wanted her to consider, and Lita can share a little bit of what some of those are in the now that she's including, but want some direction so that it's an efficient process and whatever the product is that's provided to you meets, your expectations. So, Alita, you want to share this one?
So as we all know, the biggest portion of the budget is salary and benefits. So this year, over the next 2 years, we have three contracts expiring. Our OTA contract expires in 2021, and our CSEA and support staff contracts expire this year. So in doing our projections, we have to take that in mind in determining what we're going to use as percentage increases. Won't discuss that here, but you just have to consider that. That's something that is part of the projections that needs to be considered. According to Night Shift's Empire Plan quarterly experience report, health insurance premiums are estimated to increase around 5.4% for next year, for 2020. Unknown for 2021, so we have to make some assumptions based on historical data. So we do have a sense of what the increase is going to be for half of the year for the upcoming budget, the 2020 portion, but we have to project for the second half of the year for 2021. ERS contributions, the employee contribution rates are going to remain flat based on controller's press release issued on August 29th. Based on the July actual TRS actuarial report, the 5-year rate of return will decrease from last year and will now likely be below the assumed rate of return of 7.25%. So TRS makes assumptions based on the rate of return for the market, and right now they project that it's going to be lower than what they assumed. So they are projecting that rates will increase. The finalized investment rate of return won't be available until October, so we'll keep a lookout for that to see what the actual finalized rate of return will be. We're projecting right now to keep the capital line the same, so I'm going to just leave it the way it is, not projecting any increases or decreases, because as you know, the capital line has an impact on our tax levy calculation, our tax levy cap calculation. So with regard to revenue, our biggest revenue source is the tax levy itself. Based on the first 7 months of CPI data, Consumer Price Index data, ASBO is projecting that the CPI is going to be 1.44. So that's below the 2% that's used to calculate in the tax cap formula. But we won't know until January 2020 when the actual CPI is set for the tax cap calculation. But this is something that ASBO New York is projecting, which is concerning because typically it's 2% or lower. We want to see it at 2%, but not lower than 2%. So 1.44 is kind of concerning. State aid, typically, I leave it flat. I don't know what it's going to be. I have no idea. As far as the biggest resource, which is foundation aid, that's legislatively determined, so I typically leave that flat. We will be including the additional sales tax of $915,000, so that'll be part of the revenue calculation. We'll take a look at the reserves. One reserve that I think we can consider reducing is our liability reserve. There's really no reason to continue it. It's about $158,000, but it's something that we can take a look at as far as making sure that we include programs that we want to see happen in future years and having that reserve be an offset. The appropriated fund balance, the undesignated amount above the 4%, I sent out a spreadsheet to everybody on the board showing how we come up with the undesignated fund balance. And right now it's 2.9 million. So we know that going into the budget year that we have 2.9 additional above the fund balance, the required 4%, that we can consider using to balance the budget. Any questions?
I guess, Alita, when you look at this on a 3-year basis. Can we get a model of optimistic and pessimistic ranges for things like ERS and healthcare costs in terms of when we see that 3-year plan, like to the variables you're talking about? And, you know, like you said, the night shift's projecting 5.4%, which sounds historically lower than some of the increases in the past few years. But I guess as you're looking at those numbers, can you try to give us a few scenarios of lows and highs on those?
They actually provide the previous 10 years and the previous 5 years of percentage increases. So I'm looking at those numbers as well to determine how to move forward. We know what it's going to be for upcoming 2020, but the further the years out, it's going to be harder to determine. But looking at some of the historical data that they provide might be helpful. But they
that
do
might be
have
better, actually, just to give us the grids of the last 10 years in those 3 buckets, right?
They do have that information.
Okay.
So I can share that with the board as well.
Can we look into using any of that capital reserve money for like projects such as solar panels on the schools to try to cut our energy costs? Because since we can't predict healthcare and stuff like that, can we try to alleviate costs elsewhere and try to, you know, create some streams of revenue through that? Is that feasible?
So the facility subcommittee is moving and having discussions around what the capital line recommendations would be. We actually have a presentation to the board on the 25th. It's just conceptual ideas of what's being discussed related to immediate needs and future needs of the district. That might be a good spot to begin considering, because when you start looking at, you know, what we put into the capital line, first of all, I would say we probably have to study a little bit more of, you know, what that would mean in terms of going solar and the costs associated with it, where they would go, and a variety of other variables. But adding in additional costs beyond the recommendations might be at the expense of some other projects, so we should probably look at it the whole picture is really my point. That's okay. So on the 25th, we have a facilities discussion, and the facility subcommittee's having some conversations as well.
We could also pull out the report that was done not too long ago, because there was some work done on this, and at the time with the technology, we couldn't retrofit roofs, and we would have had to clear a lot of land and be committed to long-term leases for it. So on the surface, it sounds great, but, you know, I know there's things now, don't parking garages, other things, maybe there's another way of looking at it, but
A lot has changed.
yeah. So it's been only a couple of years, but, you know, we should probably talk to.
Yeah, so we had a preliminary or pre-game conversation before the board meeting, a little bit about where we are, what we've done, so we can pull out some of the materials around that. And certainly, as we look to new construction, it might be something to consider as well. If we were to, you know, put an addition, you could, you know, potentially put solar on top, but it's a, you know, larger discussion here with the board as well. But thank you for bringing it up.
Just one other thing to bring up is the sales tax revenue. You know, we have to remember the county executive and board of legislators passed that under the guise of property tax relief. So I would just like to start the discussion, or entertain the discussion in the future of using some of that money to plug any deficit or offset expenses that would come within the tax increase up to 2%. So just something I kind of wanted to put out there, that this money again is supposed to be property tax relief, and maybe we should at least entertain the discussion of offering some property tax relief.
I mean, I think it's always been on our mind. I mean, you know, 2 years ago, we gave a substantial amount back based on really state aid at that point. So always part of the conversation, and certainly should be, you know, around this time. You got to weigh the factors of what's going on. You know, the other side of that is programs and all those pieces. So,
Of course.
but it's what we always have to do, right?
Yeah, of course.
Just had the, no? I had emailed in some questions to Alita just to explain sort of the context of Alita's ABCD spreadsheet, which I loved. There was one kind of line in there in particular that I just hadn't really seen presented that way, which was kind of our, revenues versus expense and how much we didn't spend for the year. And it makes sense not to obviously spend all your money, but it made me think, if we look back historically, is asking the question, how much each year are we not spending, and is it, based on that trend, does it maybe allow us going forward, looking at planning to spend a little bit more, a little closer to our revenue line, not obviously above the revenue line, but being, call it moderately conservative versus conservative, just like a notch up, knowing we have some money in reserves, not going crazy, but we, at the end of our budget conversations, we have those conversations of, we'd like one more of this and this and this, and it's usually, I'm guessing, like a $500,000 kind of thing, and just looking at whether we think, if we weren't as conservative, could we fund some of those things in a way that we're comfortable with. So that's kind of the. In addition, I know more the last year or two we've talked about reserves, and I just I'm always confused and have to keep asking, what does this reserve do and what does that reserve do? And so I'm hoping that one other spreadsheet might just give all of us sort of a easy resource to say, this is this reserve, this is what it does, this is the cap on it, this is what the voters need to move it back and forth, because I can't keep track of all that stuff. And not that, and I think that just helps do that. And then the facilities meeting the other day, that if we kind of know we have our, the operating budget, the projection, the reserves, and the capital sort of plan, not just the annual number, but sort of what's happening in the next 5 years or so. It seems like in the next, 3 or 4 months, we can have some really good conversations, marrying all those buckets to figure out how they relate, and we have to base, some of it's weighing capital. We could spend money on, say, solar panels, or we can have more XYZ staff, and you have to weigh pros and cons. So I think we're in a good position with this information we're putting together to, holistically look at the big picture and some detail.
Okay, so Lita's going to go forward with some of the feedback that you provided, and we'll try to create a plan, and I hope, just echoing what Mr. Galiff just said, which is between a 3-year or a long-term plan for facilities, a long-term plan financially, 3-year plan in terms of instruction, all these kind of together will help us have a rich conversation regarding what we want to include for this year's coming budget, and then projecting out and what things will look like for the future. And then having discussions of how, not only what we need, but how we go about financing it, and having some earlier discussions than we potentially had in the past. So we'll move on this, and we'll have everything, we're starting our budget process September 20th. Yeah. So documents are going out September 20th, so things are rolling right out of the gate. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more comments, questions? So this is our audience recognition moment, and so we are going to move into the next phase. For people watching at home, we don't have anybody left in the audience, but we had some good audience members here earlier who participated in our presentation and discussions. Okay, I'd like to take a motion to vote on resolutions 5.1 through 5.5.
Second.
5.1, resolution to appoint additional consultants for the 2019-2020 school year. 5.2 is a resolution to approve school building response plans. 5.3, resolution to approve a stipulation of settlement. 5.4 is a resolution to approve an agreement with the Ossining Support Staff Support Association, the OSSA, and employee number 01478. And 5.5 is a resolution to approve a last chance settlement agreement and general lease with employee number 02455. Any discussion? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? I'd like to take a motion to vote on resolution 6.1 through 6.6.
Second.
Okay. 6.1, resolution to approve quarterly student fund treasurer's fund, resolution to approve quarterly student fund treasurer's report, April through June 2019. 6.2, resolution regarding acceptance of donation of books from Emily Sack. 6.3, resolution regarding acceptance of donations for Ossining School Community Summer Program. 6.4, resolution regarding acceptance of grant from New York Life at Park School. 6.5, resolution regarding increase in budget ETS testing services for Ossining High School. And 6.6, resolution regarding interfund transfers. And I'd like to, I'd like to thank Emily Sack for the district, which we received a donation of 54 books from Miss Emily Sack. Like we have a donation from United Way and Costco, 300 filled book bags. From Westcop, 251 book bags with supplies. From 914 Cares, 2 large full bins of supplies. From GE, 3 boxes of full supplies, 6 boxes of clay. From All Star Products Company, 25, 5 each grade pre-K, kindergarten, 6th, 7th, and 8th. United Healthcare, 100 crayons, 100 rulers, and 100 notebooks. From Croton School District, 20 boxes of books. From the ShopRite in Croton, 14 cases of water, 250 hot dogs, 250 hot dog buns, 100 hamburgers, 100 hamburger rolls, and from the Ossining Rotary Club, 200 hamburgers and hot dogs. And also, one more donation I want to read out loud. We received a donation grant in the amount of $500 from New York Life for supplies. So really lots of donations, lots of hamburgers and hot dogs, and I think that went to our block parties, I believe, because that's where I saw those hot dogs and hamburgers.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, and books and crayons. All right, so any discussion, any more discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstention? Okay. I'd like to take a motion for resolution, to vote on resolution 7.1 through 7.16.
Second.
Okay. 7.1, resolution regarding rescind of professional staff appointments. 7.2, resolution regarding administrative staff resignations. 7.3, resolution regarding civil service staff resignations. 7.4, resolution regarding support staff resignations. 7.5, resolution regarding bus attendant resignation. 7.6, resolution regarding support staff request for a leave of absence. 7.7, resolution regarding professional staff appointments. 7.8, resolution regarding civil service staff appointments. 7.9, resolution regarding support staff appointments. 7.10, resolution regarding bus attendant appointments. 7.11, resolution regarding professional staff appointments before and after school programs. 7.12, resolution regarding civil service staff appointments before and after school programs. 7.13, resolution regarding support staff appointments before and after school programs. 7.14, resolution regarding per diem substitute removals. 7.15, resolution regarding per diem substitute appointments. And resolution 7.16, resolution regarding approval of school volunteers. I'd like to thank our school volunteers. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. We have another audience recognition part of our agenda. All right, moving right along, we're going to go into board dialogue and any reports, and open that up to our board for more discussion. Committee meetings, which we discussed.
Two things quickly, I think we all got a notification. ShopRite was one of the donors for the summer block parties, and on September 18th, they are having a drive, basically, where they'll be collecting at ShopRite in Croton for help bag hunger event. So anybody that shops at ShopRite, please consider going on the 18th. On October 10th at Tilly Foster Farm in Brewster, the Westchester Putnam School Boards Association and Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES will have an event for school board members on, give me 1 second. It kind of continues our mental health conversations, current issues promoting mental health for all. So wellness is a theme for the Westchester Putnam School Boards Association this year. This event should be very well attended. It's a great facility. If you haven't been out to Tilly Foster Farm, there's a lot of aspects to it. There's a culinary school, there's a working farm, but the focus of that night will be mental health, and I encourage you to attend if you can squeeze it into your calendar. I think it's going to be a great night.
Thank you.
And you should have gotten something in your email today or yesterday.
Okay. Anybody else? Greg?
I'll do facilities quick. So a couple noteworthy, the project's completed. We did a quick review. The driveway was obviously the biggest, and that's really pretty much done. We have a window project here at the high school, which I know they're going to very creatively go, almost like classroom to classroom. Classroom may move for a day or a couple days, and then we'll use breaks. But we need to get the windows, and so that one's going to be this year sometime, but some work there. And then at the next meeting, we'll have a facilities review, so we can go through that pretty quickly. But we really went through the architects sort of in working with the administrators, just school by school, here's needs and how you might meet those needs. And a chunk of it's space related, and then some of it's that are using space, existing space. And it's classrooms, and it's music, and it's cafeteria, and it's gym. So it's, it's kind of a list of lots of different ways you could address needs, and kind of begins that discussion of we'll have to over the next, well, I guess the district will come back to us with some prioritization of it, and then we'll look at it and have conversations about how to fit it in and when to fit it in. So that's your beginning, and that'll happen next meeting, get more detail.
Thank you. Anybody else?
So my semi-update, I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to just note it's been a great opening to school. I think everyone has really, staff to children, they've all come in very well prepared in terms of our staff, in terms of setting up the rooms and the professional development that's been led up to this point. And just sheer smiles everywhere you go from our children, really engaged and enjoying the learning, no matter what the building is. So I want to thank everyone for everything they did to make the opening. There have been some challenge in recognizing that transportation is probably the one that we need to realize that there has been concern, but I do want to take a moment to thank Lara and Jim for their work while we're working through some challenges. They're working tirelessly to try to address those challenges, and also ensuring that whatever we've learned from this year is something that we seek to address for the future. So I want to thank them, and I also want to thank the police department and our community for their help. They've been helpful in terms of traffic control and just helping us with our smooth opening overall. Two other things I gave every board member. Just want to thank, gratitude to Megan Massagiacomo, Alita has been part of it, Carrie Ann, Michelle, Nancy Dela Cruz, but Megan's been the glue to our work. We're hoping to lift, as you see, a catalog here of our SEL work. So that we've termed Saturday Explore and Learn. There are opportunities, and actually taking into account the feedback that the board gave us, which was, don't make it something just elementary, try to integrate middle school and high school. So you'll see components of that. Some of them our own staff, some of them are volunteers. There's a pretty rich array of offerings right now, but it's a start, and I think it's a great start, quite honestly, as we come to lift it. So we'll have, if you can join us on the 5th of October, we'll have we hope to have breakfast served for families, and then we'll go out into, the sessions, but we should just celebrate what's been done to this point, and, so I want to just put that out there. Join us. We're going to have some music, a few words, and get students into engaging, and adults into engaging learning environments. So it's kind of exciting when you see the actual program. Quite honestly, it's just becoming a reality. So very exciting. And I just I think it's important to note, and I made sure it was in the update, did some flexibility this year, particularly at Park School. Marcel 11 is, obviously an integral part to our system in supporting our families and really trying to, meet the needs in a variety of ways for all families. We're reallocating some space down there to create what we'll term as a family resource center, where it's basically a dedicated space where families can go and learn. And that she can look to actually support them in a variety of ways. So more to come on that, but we think that's an exciting whether, obviously we can do it now, we're not sure what it means for the future, but right now there's been a lot of dedicated time to give her that space that I think will be really helpful to our families in providing them classes, meeting them, talking about literacy skills, a variety of ways to meet them, and complementing some of the resources and services that we have in our community, not duplicating, but sort of complementing them and directing families to various resources that exist within our community. So more to come on that, but the space looks great, and want to thank everyone that was helpful in there. And I think that's it. The last piece, I just wrote down the chair, and I think it's really important that we don't pause to recognize why we have this desk here, and that's because when we come here, all our decisions center around children. Our conversation today was about the kids, discussions around the budget. While we talk a lot about numbers, it's about children in the end and the types of programs we want to serve. So I think periodically I just want to pause and periodically remind us that serves as a symbolic reminder for us of why we do what we do as educators, but also why the board is here, and the work and the decisions that we make ultimately need to be in the best interest of the kids that we serve in our district. So those are my reminders and my updates.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. Okay, so I'd like to take a motion to enter into executive session.
Before we do that, can I just congratulate the district and Dr. Sanchez on a great back-to-school video. We've had a tremendously positive response to it. It's every year you think that it can't get better, it does. If you haven't seen the video, I suggest you do, because it's a great one. This one's going to be a very hard one to top going forward.
Yeah, apparently it's some competition between Tom Hanks and Dr. Sanchez at the Oscars, I guess. So,
I'm sorry, that was too impressive. That was the highlight of the film, by the way, but none.
When everybody's really seeing the Tom Hanks movie in a month, they're going to really appreciate it.
Thank you, though. And I want to thank Harry, Doug, Corellis, Suke for, you saw the video, that was really well done. Go ahead.
Where is this going to be?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. It's great, we're going to have this, but it's important to know where it's going to take place. So it'll take place here at the high school, and it's important to know from a fiscal perspective why it's here. Number one, we think it's obviously centrally located, but it doesn't involve us having to open another building. We have staff here, the building's already open, so and obviously there's space here. So thank you for that reminder.
Could you let us know how sign up and registration?
Yeah, sure. So part of it will be electronic, but we realize that that's not going to be for all. So we're going to have to reach out to some families, and might even have to do some Backpack Express in terms of getting the information out. And putting on our equity lens, while we can quickly sign up, we just want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity and that we consider that in our decision making. So actually tomorrow, meaning to finalize before it goes out formally. But we recognize that we want all children. And I would say in my case, my son probably wouldn't get on because dad's not a more immediate responder to filling out the forms. It shouldn't be the parents that impact the child's ability to participate. So we want to find ways to make sure it's equitable and that, you know, we really try to lift us. So. But it's a really, you know, it's exciting. So we'll see where it goes from here.
Great. All right. So that will take a motion to move into, motion to enter into executive session.
So moved. Second.
Thank you for that.
Good night, everybody.